Well, thank you, Andre, and thank you all for coming. Let's see, you're on this side, Dorothie. That's your notes. So I want to thank Google for hosting the talk, and also for the $1 million. That was no small thing either. Andre actually had checks that we got, Whit and I got at the ACM Awards banquet last June. And as some of you may know, Dorothie and I quickly agreed that we were going to devote my half of the $1 million prize to furthering our work to build a more peaceful, sustainable planet, with the initial focus being on this new approach, which is this book. Let's see, Now, 8 years ago, I gave a talk here at Google on soaring cryptography and nuclear weapons. I always like to do things that kind of get people wondering. And my work then, and it still continues, has been on bringing risk analysis to bear on the question of nuclear deterrence. How risky is it to threaten to destroy civilization in an effort to preserve the peace? Well, my research has convinced me it's a horrendous risk, and that talk it lays out why, and this book also helps explain that. But even though that talk, you put it on YouTube, got roughly 10,000 views, which is quite a lot for an hour-long talk, almost no one is interested in nuclear weapons. Almost no one is interested in war and peace, even though their lives depend on it and they don't know it. And so about 3 years ago, Dorothie and I decided that we were going to take a new approach. Actually, it's an old approach, because 35 years ago, when I shifted my work from information security to international security, what got both of us interested in this international security wasn't wanting to save the world initially. It was wanting to save our marriage, which, now, by the way, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary on Friday. But we almost didn't make it. Not in recent years, but 35 years ago, the marriage was in some trouble. And I was so busy I didn't even know it. But Dorothie, fortunately, was watching out and started a process that we talk about in the book and we'll talk about today. And so many more people are interested in improving their relationships than are interested in improving international relationships or dealing with nuclear weapons. But as we explain in this talk, and as the book explains in more detail, the two are intimately connected. And so that's why our book's subtitle is Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet. Now, unless you're very unusual, you sometimes have painful disagreements with a spouse, a partner, in-laws, they'll come up in this talk, co-workers. And how would you like to never be in that kind of pain again? Think about it for a minute. Never be in that pain again. Well, this talk will outline how you can accomplish that. And it describes how we accomplish that, at least in our marriage. And it also will show how doing that allowed us to make a much larger contribution to world peace than we ever would have thought possible. So the theme of this talk, we discussed how to narrow it down to one sentence. Here it is. Your learning to compassionately resolve personal conflicts will help determine whether or not civilization survives. That's big. Think about it. Your impact can be that big. Plus, you'll be happier. Now, this is a short talk, and it would take a whole book to explain that. But fortunately, we've written that book, and Google very generously bought a bunch from Books Inc. and made them available to people here. And at the end of the talk, I'll mention how everyone else can get a free copy of the book. But I'll leave that for then. So where does the title, A New Map for Relationships, come from? That's the main title. Well, the first story in the book is all about that, and Dorothie is the star of that story, so she's going to tell you.
We were going to San Francisco to an event. It was a Friday evening, and well, it was an afternoon, and the sun was shining in San Francisco, and it was just beautiful. So we thought we'd drive up to Twin Peaks and enjoy the beauty of the city. And we were sitting in the car getting ready to go, and I pulled out the map. It was a paper map. It was that long ago.
No Google Maps.
And I was trying to figure out how we were going to get from Twin Peaks to our event. And Marty, without asking, took the map out of my hands. And one of my pet peeves was him doing that. He knew it would bother me. So I was furious. So I got out of the door and I slammed the door and I got out of the car and I huffed off and I was just sitting there like, I couldn't believe he did that to me again.
Of course, I actually had forgotten that that was her pet peeve, or I wouldn't have done it. But I actually didn't know what I had done at first. And so I was sitting in the car wondering what to do. I will have to admit, I was tempted to drive off. She'd stomped off like she was never coming back. I should drive off. It felt really stupid to just sit there waiting for her. It felt like she was the princess and she would calm down. And I was literally her attendant in waiting. And when she came to her senses, I would drive her someplace. But fortunately, I did not drive off.
So that was very fortunate. So I got back in the car, and Marty's reading the map like this, right? He's ignoring me and pretending like I'm not there. So this makes me even madder. So now I'm really furious. So without thinking about it, actually, I grab the map out of Marty's hands and I start shredding it. I'm tearing it into little pieces and I'm throwing it all over the car. And Marty's looking at me like, I don't know what to do next. But luckily, he started laughing. So he's laughing hysterically. I'm shredding the map. And then I start laughing hysterically. So then, at that point, what we need to do is we need to take all the pieces of the map and put it back together so we can figure out where to go. So you can see just a little shift like that, Marty deciding to laugh instead of get deeper in the garbage of our silly argument, changed everything. So just a small shift can change everything, and that's the power of compassion, which we're really talking about today. And as we wrote our book, we realized that this tearing up the map was a metaphor for the whole book, that we each brought unconscious maps to our relationship, and it kept helping us drive off cliffs. And that it was scary to leave the old map because we knew that map, but we had decided we weren't going to keep driving off cliffs, so we had to stop and make new maps and go new directions.
It's amazing how much we like holding on to those old maps, even though they keep taking us bad places. And the same is true internationally. And in this talk, we have time for just one piece of evidence, and that will be the United States national security. In 1945, at the end of World War II, we had not been touched by the Europe had been devastated, but the United States had been inviolate during World War II, our homeland. And in the intervening 72 years, we've spent literally trillions upon trillions of dollars to improve our national security. We've put some of our best minds to work to maximize the value of that investment. And let's look at where the old map has taken us. 1945, we could not be touched. 2017, we can be destroyed in under an hour by Russia, by China, and if North Korea keeps doing what it's doing, and we keep doing what we're doing with North Korea, which I'll get to in about 10 minutes, North Korea might be able to take out San Francisco. Maybe the old map is not working so well internationally as well.
So the first key step is to believe that peace is possible, internationally and personally. If we don't believe that peace is possible, it won't happen. And if it never happens, society will never see it happen, and we'll just never get there. Changes in society depend on just a few courageous individuals making shifts when societal beliefs are mistaken or wrong or misunderstood. My grandmother was born around 1900, and when she was born, women were not allowed to vote in the United States. Now, because of that, I've never missed an election. And if the suffragettes hadn't done something in around 1900, I still might not be able to vote. Mark Twain said it very well. He said, they didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. Marty and I know that peace is possible because we transformed a 35-year-old, because we transformed a turbulent marriage that was almost on the rocks 35 years ago into one where we haven't had an argument in 15 years. A marriage like that seemed impossible from where we stood there, just as many people now believe that world peace is impossible. The lessons we had to learn in our marriage were the same lessons we have to learn internationally. If we keep getting into wars, one of them will escalate into nuclear threats and therefore into nuclear war. We just can't afford it. That's why the key takeaway from this talk is you're learning to compassionately resolve personal conflicts will help determine whether civilization survives. I hope you're starting to see why this is not an overstatement.
Well, even though it's not an overstatement, many people have told me, actually several people have told me before they read the book they were very skeptical, but after reading it, we'd made a good case. Since most of you, in fact, most of you have not read the book, I'm going to give you two appraisals of the book that come from authoritative individuals that help to deal with this question of how creating true love at home actually carries over to creating peace on the planet. The first is a former Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry. He's a colleague of mine at Stanford now. He was Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton. And he calls the book truly unique and recommends, quote, that it should be read by couples seeking peace at home as well as by diplomats seeking peace in the world. Karl Eikenberry, who was a 3-star general in Afghanistan, led the coalition troops, and then later under President Obama was our ambassador to Afghanistan, also now a colleague of mine at Stanford, read the book and calls it, quote, the most thoughtful, unique, and fascinating book I've ever read on personal and international diplomacy. So skepticism's understandable, but I hope things like that, quotes like that will help you get over the skepticism, at least get you to read it on your own and form your own opinion. Now, let's see, I'm going to move this over just a little bit. How we respond to conflict at the personal level determines how we as a nation respond to conflict on the international stage. How can anyone be at war with their spouse, with colleagues at work, and say with a straight face that peace is possible in the world? It just doesn't work. It's much easier to call for world peace, I want world peace, than it is to create peace at home. I know that from personal experience, but it's also the most rewarding thing I ever did, so it was worth all that hard work. For anyone who wants to improve the world, their personal relationships are the testing ground for that larger vision. Conversely, because we have transformed our marriage from, I sometimes say we fought all the time, and Dorothie would say object. So we've changed it, frequent fights. Is that okay? Frequent fights to one where, as Dorothie's pointed out, fights are now a nightmare of the past. I didn't think that was possible, and I have to give her full credit for that vision and kind of dragging me through this process, at times kicking and screaming, and now I'm really grateful. I didn't think a marriage where you don't fight was possible. We still disagree, by the way. We disagree about a lot of things. We learn a lot from each other because we disagree. But what's the point in fighting? When did yelling at her ever get me what I wanted? And yet in the old map, that's what I kept doing. That's one of the cliffs that we kept driving off. Our marriage became a laboratory in which we carried out repeated experiments for learning how adversaries might solve what appear to be insoluble conflicts. So having achieved true peace in what had been an extremely turbulent marriage, we can say with conviction that peace is possible at the world level. Because as Dorothie said, it was inconceivable to us that we could have this kind of, at least to me, that we could have this kind of relationship, just as it's inconceivable to most people today that we could have peace at the world level. They didn't know it was impossible, so they did it. So now, you're going to tell them about my parents.
Well, I'm going to tell a story about how just one person can make a shift. There's always the question, okay, if there are two of you working, it's good, but how about if there's only one? Well, I'm going to tell you a story about my in-laws. Marty comes from a Jewish family and I don't. And his parents were very concerned about him marrying outside the faith. So I know I had this problem. So when I met his parents, they were pretty nice to me. But the day after I met his father, we were talking in the kitchen, and he said, "Dorothie, you remind me of my mother." And I said, "Why, thank you very much." And he said, "I never liked my mother. We didn't get along." So now I've got a problem. So this continued, and it was so painful for me that I tried different things. I tried taking Valium. That didn't work. Somebody at one of these talks suggested that I should have given them Valium. That didn't work. So eventually I stopped going just because it wrecked the whole, my grandchildren should have a good visit with their grandchildren. And so what I decided to do was I decided to go with total compassion. And I was going to visit, and my total goal was to make them feel loved. And nothing they said had anything to do with me. It was totally irrelevant. And it totally worked. They felt totally loved by me. They felt that I made this huge change. And they felt that all the problems in our relationship had shifted. So, and even the Jewish part went away. So compassion is a power tool. That's what I'd say about that.
And if you think about it, in the old map, Dorothie taking full responsibility and not worrying about what my parents said and deciding that the visit was a success if my parents felt loved by her no matter what they said or did, she'd be seen as a wimp, right? In the old map. And yet you can see from the results that she was far from a wimp. Compassion gave her tremendous power. So the old map and the new map are really totally different. And it's hard to understand the new map until you start experimenting with it. I know that was true for me. I now do things that would have seemed crazy to me 35 years ago, and they work out wonderfully. So what about internationally, though? Okay, we've just seen how sometimes it only takes one party to a conflict to resolve an interpersonal one. But what about internationally? How can the United States resolve the conflicts we have with nations like North Korea, Iran, Russia? I mean, those seem impossible. I mean, they have to change, don't they? Well, in the book, we have 7 international case studies, including for those 3 nations. There are 4 other nations that are dealt with. In this talk, we just have time for one. So I'm going to take what's probably the hardest one, North Korea. North Korea probably wouldn't have any nuclear weapons today if President Bush hadn't torn up a nuclear agreement that we had with them in 2002. That agreement kept them from extracting plutonium. It protected their plutonium stockpile. It was under international lock and key. When he tore it up, they kicked the inspectors out, and they started extracting the plutonium. And 4 years later, they did their first test. Now, this is so contrary to what you read in the media that when you read that section of the book, you notice lots of little numbered endnotes. Okay, now they're kind of unobtrusive that way. But if you want to see the source documents that back this up, you go to the end of the book and you can find them. And in fact, if you go online to the book's website, anewmap.com, and then you add /notes, all of those notes are repeated online with clickable links where appropriate. And so if you want to see some of these top secret documents, with the top secret crossed out, now declassified, you can see that. But in this talk, I'll just mention something that, as backup for that statement, I'll read from a paper written by a former director of Los Alamos Nuclear Weapons Laboratory. Not a peacenik. He's now a colleague of mine. It's Dr. Siegfried Hecker. And he's visited North Korea 7 times on what are known as Track 2 diplomatic missions. So he has firsthand information on this country as well as knowing nuclear weapons really well. In fact, the joke about Sig is he hasn't met a phase of plutonium he doesn't like. He's a chemical engineer by training, and plutonium is his specialty. And plutonium is really interesting. He's explained a bit of it to me. But here's what he wrote to back up what I just said. Our nuclear agreement with North Korea was opposed immediately by many in Congress who believed that it rewarded bad behavior. If that sounds like what's going on now with Iran, that's a good reason for it. Congress failed to appropriate funds for key provisions of the pact, causing the United States to fall behind in its commitments almost from the beginning. You don't read about that very much. In 2002, the Bush administration killed the agreed framework for domestic political reasons. End of quote from Hecker's paper, but the endnote has a link to the entire paper if you want to read it. So as I said, in response, North Korea kicked out the inspectors who were guarding their plutonium stockpile, and they did their first nuclear tests 4 years later. Now, our book's section on North Korea goes further and explains why North Korea would probably have over 100 nuclear weapons today if it hadn't been for that agreement. Even though Bush abrogated the agreement in 2002, it was in force for 8 years, and it had some really beneficial effects for us. Again, you don't read about that in the media. And so the reason they'd have probably 100 nuclear warheads or more, in 1994, when that agreement went into effect, they were a year or two away from completing a large nuclear reactor that would have made enough plutonium, and very good plutonium, by the way, enough plutonium for about 10 bombs a year. So let's say it's finished in 1996, 21 years have elapsed, they'd have enough plutonium for 210 warheads. Instead, they just have a very small plutonium stockpile from a much smaller reactor, 1/10 the size of that. And in fact, not only did they stop construction of that larger reactor under the nuclear agreement that we had with them, but it started to rust so badly from exposure to the elements in the 8 years that the agreement was in force that when Hecker was there on his last visit in 2010, he told me he saw cranes that were having to dismantle it because it was going to fall down from exposure to the elements. And so when he gave a guest lecture in one of my, in a seminar I ran on nuclear weapons risk and hope at Stanford, on North Korea, he made a column A, what we got from nuclear diplomacy with North Korea, and column B, what they got. And if you look at the two columns, we got more from nuclear diplomacy with North Korea than they did. And that's, again, very contrary to the impression you get from reading the media. And so it's important to go back and get at the facts and avoid the fake news. So internationally, as well as interpersonally, it's often possible for us to make progress on resolving a conflict when it seems like the other side's not interested. I mean, that same thing happened here in our relationship. So many times I felt like I was doing earlier, not the last 10, 15, even 20 years, but 25 years ago, I remember I was so mad at her at times because I was doing all this hard work. I was committed to doing it, and she wasn't doing a damn thing. Guess how she felt? The mirror image. It felt to her like she was doing all of it, because you don't realize when the other person's doing the hard work. They're just doing what they should be doing, right? But the same is true internationally in many cases. There's another example of one party to a conflict starting a process of reconciliation. And this one is particularly nice for here at Google because it involves cryptography. And it's also nice because I was one of the parties to the conflict, but I wasn't the one who initiated the resolution. It was the director of NSA at the time, Admiral Bobby Inman. This was 1978. So as some of you know, but background for the rest of you, in the 1970s, I was at war with NSA. There were a number of reasons, but I'll focus here on publishing my papers on cryptography, including the one which was cited in the Turing Award, New Directions in Cryptography, which appeared in November 1976. NSA was took the position that work in cryptography, research in cryptography, was born classified, meaning that even though I had no benefit of classified information, nor did Whit Diffie in writing that paper, NSA had the right to stop its publication, and I was in violation of the law and could be prosecuted and even thrown in jail for publishing it in international journals, because it was then being exported. Well, I fought back. I'm from the Bronx. And I fought back. Dorothie was very grateful when it became big news because she said, now if something happens to you, there will be an investigation. But we never talked directly. We were fighting it out in the press. And of course, we didn't get very far. Until 1978, so several years into the fight, I get a call at my office at Stanford, and it's from the director's office at NSA. And they tell me that the director, Admiral Bobby Inman, is going to be in California in a couple of weeks, and would I be willing to meet with him? Well, I jumped at the opportunity. I mean, here we were fighting it out in the press. And a couple of weeks later, Inman shows up at my office, and he told me that he was meeting with me against the advice of all the other senior people at the agency. But, and these are the key words, he said, but I don't see the harm in talking. Now, what's our position with North Korea today? We're not going to talk to them unless it's about their getting rid of their weapons. What's the harm in talking? But coming back to Inman, he told me another thing. He looked over at me and he said, nice to see you don't have horns. That's how I was being portrayed at NSA. And I can understand why they saw it that way. And I looked back at him and I said, same here. Because I'd been demonizing NSA. I mean, they were threatening to throw me in jail. Some people told me my life might even be in danger, maybe not from them, but from their foreign equivalents. And it was nice to really see a human being and stop the demonization process. And from that initial meeting, which was very cautious, our relationship grew to the point that we now regard each other as friends. And that relationship, that friendship, played a role, and maybe even a key role, in liberalizing eventually liberalizing the export regime for encryption, so that today products that we use on our smartphones, on our computers, can have relatively strong encryption that was impossible in 1978. And so there was a really positive outcome from what's the harm in talking, and I think we need to take that to heart, both internationally, like with North Korea, and certainly it played a big role in this relationship. Well, there's a lot more that could be said, but that's why we have the book. We don't have 10 hours for the talk, so we hope you'll read the book. There are copies in the back of the room, and I thank Google for making them available free of charge to those of you here. The rest of you out there, gee, how do we get free books? Well, it's really easy. You go to the book's website, anewmap.com. So that's the first three words of the title, anewmap, runtogether.com. Go to the Get the Book tab, and there's a link there for getting a free PDF. Okay, we can't give everybody free hard copies, but you can download a free PDF. And it also has links to Amazon and Barnes & Noble, so you can order it that way. Let's end by returning to the key takeaway that we want you to get from this talk. Your learning to compassionately resolve personal conflicts will help determine whether civilization survives. And here I'm going to go to former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. It turns out she and Dorothie and I share a common mentor, a common teacher. His name was Professor Harry Rathbun. He was born in the 1890s, died in the 1980s, so he was into his own 90s. He lived to about, I think, 93, 94 years of age. And Justice O'Connor knew him around 1950 when she was an undergraduate at Stanford. Dorothie and I knew Harry in the 1980s toward the end of his life. And here's what Justice O'Connor wrote in a letter encouraging Stanford students to work with me on a related project. Because we both had learned so much from Harry, she was willing to write this letter encouraging them to work on a project. And here's the quote from the letter. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, Professor Harry Rathbun repeatedly emphasized to me that a single caring individual could make a difference in this huge world and might even help determine the course of events. You can see that relating to the takeaway from this talk. I had not heard that before, but he put it forward so persuasively that many of us came to believe it might be true and to take seriously the notion that we could make a difference. I can now say unequivocally that he was right. End of quote from Justice O'Connor. So Dorothie and I fully agree, and we're going to end this part of the talk with one of Harry's pearls of wisdom that I'll never forget. And he summarized it by, why not assume the nobler hypothesis? Well, in this situation, there are two hypotheses. The nobler hypothesis is that we human beings are capable of radical change so that we can have true love in our relationships even 50 years into them. And we can bring peace to the planet, as impossible as that might seem. That's the nobler hypothesis. The less noble hypothesis, which is prevalent in society, is that that's impossible. Well, Harry pointed out, if we accept the less noble hypothesis, we're doomed even if we were capable of radical change, because we won't be motivated, we won't think we can make a difference. They knew it was impossible, so they didn't do it. And we're going to go down in a nuclear war at some point in time, because it's only a matter of time before one of these needless wars escalates out of control. The nobler hypothesis is that we are capable of that radical change. And the worst that happens if we accept the nobler hypothesis is that we go down fighting. And we might, I think, in fact, more than might, I think we have a good chance of actually making it as a civilization. So I can still see Harry telling me this toward the end of his life with a twinkle in his eye. He said, why not assume the nobler hypothesis? Indeed, why not? So let's see, there's one more thing. That's really the end of the call to action. But now, if you agree and want to do something, what can you do? So I've got a small list here, but I need to turn a page. Well, read the book. That would be a great start. Or at least start to read the book. If you don't like it, give it to someone else. But if you like it, read the thing. If you like it, get another copy and give it to friends or family. We also have cards that we'll put out on the table up here. They're very inexpensive. They cost a couple of cents each, with the name of the book, the website, and an email address. If you want to take 5 or 10 of them, if you have 5 or 10 friends that you'd recommend the book to. And recommend they download the PDF, and the website will allow them to do that. If you'd like to continue this discussion, if you want to play a more direct role, email us at the email address on that card and say, hey, I want to get involved. What can I do? And we'll figure something out. If you do those things, you'll not only help to make the world a better place, your life will get better as well. So we hope you'll join us. Thank you very much. So now we go to questions.
One can gain a tremendous satisfaction from telling other people that they're wrong. And this sort of pursuit of truth is something that's counterproductive, I think, in a lot of heated discussions in a relationship or political disagreement. Is there any way to have that satisfaction of, proving the facts and still reconcile with the opposing party?
Tell them about the card you put on our bedroom door. Or something.
You can either be right or you can be happy.
There's another thing that I would add to that. She actually had a card, and she found it in the store and bought it and taped it to the door to our bedroom. And every time I walked in and out, I had to see that. And as a Stanford professor, I used to want to be right. Now I'd rather be happy.
What's really important is to understand the joy of coming to an understanding together of something that works right for everybody. That joy is so much more than the joy of being right. For everybody to be right. So that's what I'd say about that.
I was wondering, with the Republican and Democratic parties, labeling everything as fake news, and there seems to be no path towards reconciliation under what's currently happening. What do you think would be best to move that situation forward?
What are you getting?
I just happened to bring a copy of Time magazine with me. The fake news is primarily being, let's see, depending which side you're on. I mean, it all surrounds President Trump and whether he's got fake news or whether the news about him is fake. It's important to recognize that most of the news you're reading internationally is fake news. I'll give you an example. This is, I think, the current issue of Time magazine. And it's got 5 essays on North Korea in it. And one of them says, let's see. Successive U.S. administrations, this is written by a former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and another person. Successive U.S. administrations have tried various strategies to thwart the dangerous trajectory of the North Korean regime. Some have made progress only to be set back by North Korean perfidy, by changes in policy directions, and by cautious partners and allies in the region. Now notice, what you tend to come away, I mean, while they do say several things, the one you remember is North Korea's bad behavior. And yet go back to the other ones are actually more important from our point of view, because that's where we have power. And I mean, the basic impression I get from reading about North Korea in the media, including the New York Times and Time magazine and the more progressive side, is that it's a waste of time doing nuclear diplomacy with North Korea. They delay, all the time cheating, even though there's no cheating to be done. And then when you have an agreement, they cheat, and then they blackmail you. Well, compare that with what I told you today, and which you can verify on your own. And if you find that I'm wrong in any way or have any questions, email me, and I'd be happy to find out about that. But I think you'll find that it's right.
There is something else. It's a mess. But when Trump comes up with something true, like we're not so good after all, everybody jumps all over him and says, how could you say that? So we're not ready for prime time.
Right, that was when he was saying something positive about Putin, and I think it was on Fox News even, the interviewer said, but Putin's a murderer. And he said, well, we're not so innocent either. And both left and right jumped on him about that. The only place we can really stop killing the needless killing in the world is where we're responsible for it. That's where we have direct control. And there's been a lot of needless killing that we've done. But yet, he, as Dorothie said, he gets jumped on for that.
The world seems to be in some conflict with the natural world as well. Does your set of principles apply to the non-human organisms on this planet?
Sure, things like global warming, environmental degradation. Yeah, the group that we got involved with back in 1980, which by the way doesn't exist anymore, so we're not trying to recruit for that group, plus we left it in Dorothie left in 87 and I left in 88, started with environmental issues. That was 1980. 1981, Reagan became president and brought the nuclear threat into sharp focus for us. And just as Trump is doing that for many people today. So that's another positive to the Trump presidency. The world was dangerous under Carter. The world was dangerous under Obama. But only under Trump, only under Reagan did it become clear to the public. And we realized that the greatest environmental threat of all was a nuclear war. And that's when we shifted our energy from environmental degradation in general to nuclear war in particular. And as we researched nuclear war, we concluded you couldn't deal with nuclear war in isolation. You had to deal with the whole war system that North Korea, for example, sought nuclear weapons, partly because it feared conventional attack by the United States, which was much more powerful. And so it definitely applies to those other issues as well.
And the same principles needed to get away from war, the same principles we need to address global warming and all global issues.
Yeah, and so we didn't have time to go in. We talked about compassion. The other approach looking at it is holistic thinking. If we seek solutions, we had to seek solutions that worked for both of us. We need, as a nation, to seek solutions that work for the whole world. And just as we found out that giving up what we thought we wanted and seeking those holistic solutions usually produced things that were better for me and better for her than what we thought we wanted going into it, the same would be true for the United States internationally.
So I'm trying to put together the take-home from this talk. And I could sort of see it with relationships, assume my partner, my wife is, is well-meaning and understanding and she wants the best and I do and we can work it out. But I'm having trouble with that same idea with, Al-Qaeda, North Korea, et cetera. Are there people who are evil and want our demise? Are you saying, yes, maybe there are, but we should talk to them anyway and it'll work out? But practically speaking, what is the take home with, difficult situations where people don't have our best interest at heart?
Good question. Well, we've already dealt with North Korea. I mean, to some extent, did I mean,
All I've heard is that we should talk to them.
Oh.
But practically speaking.
and we should recognize the mistakes we've made instead of accepting the societal belief in America is that it's all North Korea's fault. And if you read the North Korean section of the book, which will take you 5 to 10 minutes, you'll come away with a very different picture, and then go to the sources and see if I'm wrong on anything. So, but let's take Al-Qaeda, which is harder. I mean, to the extent that Al-Qaeda seems largely responsible for September 11th, what a horrible, horrible thing. Well, it helps to try to understand their perspective. You don't necessarily agree with it, but it helps to understand the perspective, and we'll be able to combat them more effectively if we do, rather than just demonizing them. Turns out, Osama bin Laden felt that the United States was responsible for 4 million Muslim deaths, including many children. He blames both us directly, like for the Iraq War and the sanctions that followed, but also our support for Israel and how that has affected. Now, he may be wrong on the numbers, but he does have a legitimate point there that we have not been adequately concerned with Muslim deaths. And he then goes to an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which I disagree with. But if we would understand, instead of just demonizing him, if we would try to understand where he came from, it might help us to realize where we could pull back in the world, where we're actually creating more jihadists. It's often said when we have a drone strike that kills innocent civilians, you may take out one jihadist, but you create 10 more. We need to look at that.
The other thing that we really don't consider is that they really want to be okay. They want to survive. We've taken out a lot of what we call bad actors. You know, we've killed a lot of leaders because they didn't follow all rules. And I think that if you look at North Korea, they're not very happy to be playing with us because we don't play by very good rules. And so I think you need to consider that when you think that they're willing to deal with us at all.
Yeah. Oh,
So I think we need to talk to them and treat them as if they have a right to do their thing their way.
Not here, but over there.
Right. And I don't think we do that, do you?
Well, North Korea, we're out for, one of the things we say in the book is we're out for regime change in North Korea. I mean, we don't often put it that bluntly, but if you think about it, and you look at how we've done regime change in Iraq, regime change in Libya, and we're trying to do it in Syria, you can see where the North Koreans would believe that we're out for regime change there. And if you study it, you'll see that we really want it. And the sanctions are partly intended to cripple the regime economically and produce a revolution. Now, regime change in North Korea, let's imagine you're Kim Jong-un. What is regime change going to mean for you personally in your life?
Not good.
You're going to die. Right, so as long as we're out for regime change, the only way you can counter us is with nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Now, I don't like the regime over there, but we have a decision to make. Are we going to give up on regime change in North Korea and then have some hope of reining in their programs, or we're going to keep going for regime change, in which case there's no way they're going to give up their programs. And we made it harder, by the way. And this is in the North Korea section of the book. In 2003, Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program. President Bush, in a speech that's on the State Department website, so you don't have to take my word for it, welcomed him into the family of nations and said this good behavior will be rewarded. In 2011, when we helped get the guy murdered, North Korea put out a press release that said, yeah, we've learned our lesson, that's how you reward good behavior. So it's not to overlook the danger that these people pose to us. It's not to become some Pollyanna, but it's to start getting beyond our fears, our anger, and our hatred and dealing with it more objectively. And by the way, the other thing you have to worry about, this new map is not going to take over the nation all at once. And so even if we were Pollyannas, you wouldn't have to worry about things changing immediately. And as this started to gain traction, then you could see whether we need to pull back. Another question in the back.
How do you maintain peace in your marriage now, and do you have a daily or weekly practice that helps to maintain that?
We practice positive, unconditional regard. We know that the other person has their best intent for us, and we practice compassion. And we spend a lot of time telling each other how much we love each other. We spend time, we spend little moments with each other. When we're away, we call each other, remind each other that we love each other, and we're grateful for each other. Would you add anything?
Yeah. So one of the short takeaways in the book is get curious, not furious. It used to be when she did things that I didn't like, I'd get angry at her. I'd yell at her, which then started a cycle of psychological violence. Now, when she's doing something that seems strange or crazy to me, I ask her questions. And there's a story in the book about a new car 2.5 years ago. Our cars at that point were 3 years old and 6 years old, and we typically keep cars for 10, 15 years. And so this crazy woman is looking at new cars. And the only thing, I mean, that's how it seemed. I mean, I knew she wasn't crazy, but I couldn't get past the feeling that what she was doing was crazy. And so I went to her and I said, what you're doing feels crazy to me, but I know you're not crazy. What am I missing? I got curious instead of furious. She then explained that the newer car, the 3-year-old car, had a backup camera and blind spot detection that the 6-year-old car did not have. Those safety features made her much more comfortable driving. And the new car she was looking at had even more safety features like collision avoidance for rear-end collision. And at our age, it would, and especially with some medication she's on, it would give her more independence. All of a sudden, what had seemed crazy was brilliant, not only for her, but for me. It's made my driving a lot more comfortable. In fact, every time we drive that car on a road trip, I thank her for doing this thing that seemed crazy to me. The other thing I'd add, Elaine, is that, and it kind of relates to what Dorothie said, every relationship has a bank account of goodwill. When we first met and we were madly in love, we got married 9 months after we met. You only took 7, I know, Tim, but we were pretty clearly madly in love. The bank account was overflowing. Anything she wanted, I wanted to do for her, and vice versa. But then life set in, 2 kids, a mortgage, financial questions, and the bank account went from positive to 0, and it was headed for what's called marriage bankruptcy. And it took us years to rebuild the bank account. But now the bank account is so positive that we can have that unconditional positive regard. And a small thing that feels like a slight or feels like wrong, like her looking at the cars, does not become the big issue it would have 30 years ago.
Yeah, with regard to like international issues, America versus Al-Qaeda, whatever, I mean, I'm wondering how these principles can help there, because in the end of the day, you can only control your own actions. You can't really control what Al-Qaeda or whoever is on the other side, or maybe even your spouse is going to do. And I'm wondering what kind of actual practical, advice you might have that might help the world become a better place, because it's only we who can control our actions and we can't control what other people do.
Well, there's a story in there where I have this epiphany, which relates very much to what you say. We had a huge fight, it must have been 30 years ago, maybe more, and I cooled down enough to think through, and I realized, now, which would I rather was true? That my current perception was correct, that it was all this crazy woman's fault, which is how I saw her at that moment, in which case I was powerless to get out of the pain I was in, or would I rather that I was missing something and I had played a part in this fight, in which case I could apologize for that, which would give me power to start a process that might get me out of the pain I was in. With that motivation, I found the role I had played in the fight, apologized to her, she apologized for what she'd done, and the argument ended. And in the same way, I'm not saying Al-Qaeda will respond that way, but all we can do is look for where we've made mistakes and correct those. And fortunately, there are a huge number of mistakes that we've made as a nation that we could correct. I also would recommend that we don't start with Al-Qaeda or with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, we had a section on Israel in an early draft of the book that we pulled out.
No, I totally buy all this. I'm just wondering from a practical standpoint, how much we...
Practical standpoint? Well, we also should go for the low-hanging fruit. So just like Israel-Palestine is not the low-hanging fruit, Russia-US is the low-hanging fruit. What really do we have, what conflicts do we have with Russia really? Ukraine, not that big a deal. And in fact, Russia...
Maybe he's mean talk to your congressman and those sorts of
things. You're asking what can we do as individuals? Yeah. A couple of things. First of all, the most effective thing you can do is to bring greater and greater peace to your personal relationships, because that will motivate you to continue the process And it will make you a convincing advocate for these seemingly impossible changes at the international level. You can also, if you really want to play a role, contact us. We'll talk through our email address on the cards. And we'd love to talk with you about what role you might play. I contribute to a number of congressional candidates. And the way I choose them is when they call me. And once you give to a few, a whole bunch start calling you. I have this huge target painted on me. I always discuss with them these issues, North Korea, Russia, and whether they're interested in forming a more objective-based foreign policy instead of based on the demonization of Russia that we have and so on. And I'm actually working with some of them to see whether we might get that information out to other people within Congress. But if you don't give money to congressmen, you can always write letters to your congressmen, your senators. And you might wonder, living in California, what difference that makes. Because like Feinstein, for example, Senator Feinstein, is going to vote the way I would want it to on most of these issues. But someone pointed out to me, who really knows how Washington works, that lobbying Feinstein is very important on these issues because she has great political capital in D.C. People on both sides of the aisle respect her. But how she spends that political capital depends on what she sees as important. And getting her to move these issues up in her agenda will cause her to do more.
There is one other thing that's important. We don't know how these changes are going to occur. Just like in 1900, we didn't know how we were going to get to women voting in 1920. But we knew that the more people talked about this, the more they acted on it, the more it spread, it was going to happen. So we don't know the magic that happens out there to get something like this started. All we know is that we can do our part. We can talk to people about it. We can behave it. We can do what we can. But we can't see from here to there to know. We can only do our part.
Yeah, get a group of friends together to all read the book and discuss each chapter and tear it apart and see whether you agree or disagree. That creates a small group, but that's how all these things work.
Thank you very much, Martin and
Well, thank
Dorothie, for coming, and let's give them a round of applause.